Welcome to CivilNet. My guest today is David Matz, who has served as the Director of Graduate Programs in Dispute Resolution at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, where he also teaches mediation and conflict resolution. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
You have a lot of experience working with diasporas, especially the Israeli diaspora in the US. What do these diasporas have, what role do they play in terms of supporting small states with democratization processes and institution building?
That's a very timely question. For many, many years, the diaspora, which largely means Jews in America, though some in Europe and other parts of the world, played a role that was largely supportive of the creation of the state, the support of the state, and it meant supporting the government. And for many years, that was not terribly controversial. That worked. There was money, there was support, there were letter writings. America is important for Israel, so there was pressure on the American government, but very coherent, very straightforward. In the last 15, 20 years, more and more American Jews have been unhappy with the Israeli government, unhappy with its attitude toward Palestinians, toward settlements, toward democratization within Israel. So for many years, those American Jews didn't know who to talk to, how to have a voice. You would see a letter to the editor, an academic article. So there was created, needless to say, it's a very complicated story, it always is, but an organization in the last 10 years called J Street. And that is the alternative voice. That's how they talk about themselves. We are the voice that disagrees with the mainstream Jewish view. And in fact, they claim we represent the majority view.
Do they?
It's a very good question. There are polls that support that view. There's a question of what it means to say support. If there was a war, what side would people be on? That's different than when there's not a war and people are saying this politician is doing a bad job and this one's doing a good job. But it's certainly a fair question. It's not one-sided. It is still true that the mainstream Jewish organizations have much more clout, they have more money, they have big name people, very important people. But J Street and other organizations to the left of J Street, to the right of J Street, have become much more important in the last 10 years. For example, when the United States was negotiating with Iran over the nuclear deal, which was very important to Israel, Israel was very much a player, the mainstream organizations opposed that agreement, worked very hard to oppose, very publicly opposed. J Street supported the agreement, and the agreement was reached. Now, I don't say it was J Street, just a small group of Jews who made it happen. No, it was much larger. The President of the United States was in support and the Secretary. But J Street was a very loud alternative voice, and that happens over and over even today, particularly today on issues of democratization. Because there's, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
There are a number of things that the Israeli government is doing with regard to free speech, with regard to freedom of association, with regard to the role of religion in the state, all of which are seen by people like me, but many others, as shrinking democracy within the country. So now J Street is very strongly voicing itself on issues of pushing back on, for example, there's a rule now that if, there's an Israeli rule that if you support an organization that is in favor of boycotting Israeli products, you may not come into Israel. It's a very dramatic change, it's a very dramatic rule, and J Street is very much against that rule and makes noise. J Street's contribution is to put the pressure on American legislators. Since America gives so much aid of many kinds, not just money, to Israel, pressure on the American government can be important, and I think is.
Yes.
Is it, I'm sorry?
I was just going to go off of that topic you discussed on the diasporas. There's always this traditional organization and institutions, like in the Israeli case and the Armenian case as well, right? You have AIPAC, and I'm not sure where you would fit in J Street, but then there's always the diasporas or communities or just people who are not don't belong to any institution or organization? How do you engage those people? How does the state either mobilize or connect with those people, those diasporas?
Well, if you're asking how the state of Israel connects, it uses patriotism. There's Israel Independence Day, parades all over the United States. If the Prime Minister of Israel is coming, there will be big celebrations. This is supporting the government's policy, and it is said supporting Israel. But there are many other ways. Individual American Jews or synagogues, small groups of Jews, may have their own relationships. They go and they make their own tour, and they visit whom they want to visit. They send money, not necessarily through the formal channels, but many other channels, legal channels, I hope, but other ways of making their voice known.
What happens when the priorities in terms of policy of the diaspora and the state don't align? Do they have to align? Is it best that they align, or is it best that they challenge?
Well, as you can imagine, that's a very controversial subject. And when AIPAC, the group representing the mainstream, gets angry at J Street, it says, you are dividing the Jews, you are undermining support of America for Israel. It's very easy to be angry at that view and say it's just your way of trying to suppress alternative speech. It's not completely a hallucination. Jews have done very well by staying together and having a unified voice. There is a value in that kind of unity, but there's a very heavy cost for that kind of unity. And the more there is pressure on, it's called the left wing, the people who are in favor of more democratization, the more it is difficult for the right wing to support the idea that unity is the only value. And that is not, that is not, when I was growing up, that was the single dominant view. Don't hang your laundry out in public. Don't let the non-Jews see what the fights are among us. Keep them away. They shouldn't know what we're doing. That's not
the perception of a unified.
That's right. It's very important that we all sound alike in public. That's changed. Now there are many voices. There are publications, newspapers, magazines, letters to the editor, public speakers on campuses, all over. So it's a much more it's still fighting. I don't mean everything's accepting. There are a lot of people saying you shouldn't let him speak here. He's not a critic. He is against the existence of Israel. The existence, that's the big issue. The legitimacy of the country is the argument made. And so there's a delicacy between, is criticism not loyal? When is it not loyal? Is it loyal? So that's where the fights are now, and lots of them.
David, you also have a lot of experience, over 30 years of experience in conflict mediation, both globally with your work in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as well as locally working with judges in city courtrooms. When it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, how would you describe the process of the peace process? What are the lessons that can be learned? Some would say that it has not been successful. How would you describe it? And what are the lessons that the international community can learn?
Do you have 2 or 3 hours?
No, but
no? Oh, all right. Well, let me see if I can do it in a shorter time. First, it's not going anywhere right now. It's absolutely stone cold still. There's nothing happening. Israel has no real incentive to negotiate now. Objectively, if you can step back and say, why should they? What can they gain? They have no reason to. The Palestinians have incentives, but they have not been able to get their own act together. So there's conflict at the leadership. The violence is only one sign. The violence in many ways is a lesser sign. What's really a problem is Abbas, the president of the Palestinians, really can't deliver the people. If he made a deal, it's not at all clear that his people would go with him. So there's real trouble on both sides, very different kinds of trouble, but very, very difficult on both sides. Because Israel has so much more power, it probably, if it wanted a deal, would have the power, the ability to try to help the Palestinians get organized, because it's in the Israeli government interest that the Palestinians can't get their act together.
Is it also a failure of having a viable mediation body?
No. There are more mediators running around. I'm one, I'll buy one. There are many, many mediators, many people who could mediate, many organizations that could mediate. We have had many mediators there, working very hard. I am not critical of the mediation world at the local individual level or at the larger organizational level. We've had presidents try to mediate. Jimmy Carter mediated successfully in 1978. Bill Clinton tried, his was not successful. I have studied those very closely. They were good mediations. They did what you want mediators to try to do.
So it's a lack of political will?
I have trouble with the concept of will. It's too mystical for me. There are a whole variety of reasons you can analyze why was Jimmy Carter successful in 1978 and Bill Clinton was not successful in 2000. It's not will. Clinton worked really hard. So did his staff. They wanted it. I mean, it was not by any reasonable definition of will. There are a lot of explanations of why they didn't succeed, but I think certainly the mediator's will is not one of the things that I would put the blame on.
Okay. And if we talk about mediation processes inside countries, inside small states, why are these mediation processes important for democratic countries? As you know, Armenia recently went through a transition, a velvet revolution as we call it, where systems are beginning to change, and the public will look forward to more of these types of changes, I think, in all structures.
And so a major question is the democratization process, not only at the top and who's the president and which party is in power and the next election, but at the grassroots. Who wants to be a democratic citizen? It's a lot of work, and you don't always know what you're doing. It's confusing, it's complicated. You've got a family to take care of. You don't have time to study all these. So how do you know who to vote for or how to vote? I have a colleague whose academic subject is civil society as an educational tool for democratization. And one of those tools is teaching people about negotiation and mediation, so that inside a church, in a community, with an NGO, how do they relate to each other? How do they deal with each other? And his notion is if we teach them negotiating, and we doesn't mean the Americans come in and teach. He means if the society decides that a very important tool for teaching them to get along with each other is learning to negotiate, learning to mediate or bring in a mediator or when to bring in a mediator, that will help when the larger fights occur. We'll be used to saying, okay, this is a little simple-minded, but are there ways we can compromise? Now, it's never that simple a sentence, but that's a different attitude than how can I make sure that she doesn't do that again? Right. Those are different attitudes toward the conflict. So yes, civil society can be very important in educating the whole society for long-term democratization.
Okay, thank you very much, David. It was a lovely conversation, and stay tuned for more conversations with CivilNet.